Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. We are today launching a brilliant book that has come out recently. It's called Womansplaining Navigating Activism, Politics and Modernity in Pakistan, edited by Senator Sherry Rehman, who's also the president of Jinnah Institute, and my first editor. I have to tell you all that. And Sherry has brought together 22 pioneering and some new entrants to the struggle also, but pioneering women's rights activists and campaigners together in this book. There are from Farida Shaheed to Khawar Mumtaz who are with us today. There are 20 other women who have contributed to this compilation, and it recounts the successes and some of the failures also of the women's movement. And I must say that it is a landmark because nobody has actually brought together. I know I'm familiar with Farida Shaheed's work on this subject, and also Khawar Mumtaz's work, and many others who are included in this collection. But this book brings all different voices from literature, from media, from rights activism. People who have taken to streets, people who have actually worked on policy and legislation. So they are all together in this collection. And I think it needs to be translated into Urdu. And I've been told recently by the editor, Sherry, that they are going to offer an Urdu translation pretty soon, very soon. And I'm very happy that Senator Sherry Rehman is with us. Sherry I think she's been in Parliament since we were kids, and it's the fourth term, isn't it? And she's also been our ambassador to United States. How sensitive. And she's also she's been a journalist all her life, all her career, and she's still very proud of being a journalist, and she associates with journalists like very few in Pakistan, among the Pakistani politicians. And she's also served for some years as federal minister for information and broadcasting. So thank you very much, Sherry, for taking time out this morning to speak about your book. And then we have Motarma Khawar Mumtaz. Khawar Mumtaz is one of the pioneers of the women's movement in Pakistan. She was one of the co-founders of the Women's Action Forum and also Shirkatgah Women's Resource Center. And she has also served for 2 terms, I believe, as the chairperson of the National Commission on Status of Women. So she has worked on both sides. So she understands the society as well as the polity of how things work, and how women have actually gained through policy and legislation, as well as by waging struggles in the last 40 years of Pakistan's history, or even earlier also, because we can't forget Motarma Fatma Jinnah. And then we have Motarma Farida Shaheed. She's currently heading Shirkatgah Women's Resource Center, but she's an internationally recognized researcher and author. And as I have already mentioned, that she has done some, seminal work on women's rights, as far as documenting and theorizing the movement is concerned. But today, we are going to talk about what is in the book, the personal journeys of the editor and the contributors who we are fortunate to have with us. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions. And then, ladies, you are more than, we will be very happy if you can add whatever you wish to add, looking at the current femicide that we experience in Pakistan, and the whole mobilization of religio-political parties against the domestic violence bill. So, we'll be very happy to listen to you on all these issues that are current. But also, let me ask my first question and go to Sherry. Sherry, what made you think of this project and this brilliant effort that you have put in? What was the motivation really?
Thank you, Haris, for that very generous introduction. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the 2 heroes, feminist heroes sitting here. We've always looked at their work, at the struggle. And, there were a couple of motivating thoughts that led to this. So one was that there was no one intellectual repository, if you like, of the original women's movement. And Farida has said both of you have written that book, which I used to hang on to with dear life and rarely find a copy. And it was the first book really that charted the course of that critical struggle.
Sherry, we are
And
losing you.
are you losing me? Am I all right with you? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can
Can
hear
you?
you now.
Okay. So, the Women's Action Forum, the Tehreek-e-Niswa, the Sindhyani Tehreek, many flowers bloomed during that crucial resistance struggle that sisters such as yourselves were in the front line of. And I thought it was very important. I also became politically active by being radicalized on the street as a 19-year-old against, Regal Chowk pe khade hain jaake, and finding not enough critical mass to challenge the establishment. And we now today see a very different terrain of that the women's movement is trying to map it. Some even question if indeed it is a movement compared to the earlier one of the 1980s, which was coherent, and it had a identifiable series of goals, a shared kind of community of interests. So I wanted to build a kind of repository of women heroes telling their own stories, and addressing as thought leaders concerns about the past, and building bridges between today and then, because there are clear differences in, say, what the Aurat March and many colors of the rainbow. It's large. It mobilizes a great number. But I want to see the differences. I want to build sort of have a convergence of values, if you like, and see how we can build on these solidarities through larger convenings such as this. And I know you all engage in such exercises, but they're very important to me because I see a political disengagement today, and that limits the reaching of goals or the outcomes that are sought, and of course it also limits the area of responses that then the state is liable to make. It's a great change in terms of mapping the terrain of these two or three women's movements. There are two largely identifiable ones now, the original one, and some call it the fourth wave, some call it the second. My point is there is a momentum, there is a clear anger in young women as they see heinous crimes, and it's mostly reactory, it's mostly social. They're responding to social crises and barriers that they're facing as young women entering the workforce or the public sphere, or even navigating private spaces. So also it gives them an understanding of where we have come from and how far we need to go, and perhaps ask more questions and probe where we could, many of us can drive this forward in for more optimal outcomes. So today there's a great larger, I mean, across the board, gatherings and very large convenings, and different classes are mobilized. They're more visible than they used to be. The critique used to be that, the WAF is an urban elite movement. Well, my response to that is not so urban and not so elite, but the point is the elites also have a responsibility, and they spoke to that responsibility by coming out and speaking out and effecting change in very difficult circumstances. But today's circumstances and environment has its own challenges, and there's a restricting of space. There's a constant call to put women's voices in boxes, to limit movement, to limit mobility, to constantly see reactionary impulses try to turn back the tide. And you both know very well, and Haris, you do too, how gains that women make are constantly under under a sort of reversals. Your own
Yeah,
book
that's
is
right. Yeah.
steps back and one step forward, right? So the reversals are a part of our lives, and they often drain hope from the short fuse that we see around us. But I think this is also an exercise in building solidarity, building bridges, and infusing hope and some amount of channeling the anger that we see today towards a more coherent set of
Sharia,
outcomes. And yeah,
yeah.
so
Sherry, I
that
would
was
like
my.
to move. Yeah, thank you very much. But I would like to move to Farida now, and because Farida has actually recounted, I mean, in her essay, the first essay in the book, Anatomy of Resistance, she has actually brought together the whole experience of women's movement in Pakistan. And and listening to you, I was also thinking that their book, the book that they did is called Two Steps Forward, One Step Back. Perhaps isn't that the title? But I think, I mean,
Question mark.
unfortunately, and there is a question mark, but I think somehow I don't want to feel, or sound cynical, but it's one step forward and two steps back, unfortunately, in the past few years, as we observe. So, Farida, I would like to ask you about your personal journey. What made you in what you have become? What were the motivations, and what were the factors? And when did it all start? I mean, this journey to feminist ideals. And so that I don't interrupt you in the middle, I would also like to ask another question: that how do you see the link between the class and the identity movements today? Because when and you have talked about it in your essay, so that's where I got my cue from, is that the movement has become, I mean, it started off as a political movement when women's rights were actually being suppressed by the state, and it was a reactive movement, and now it's more personal. So how do you see the link, that how can that link be recreated between the class and identity movements that we used to see in the 1980s? Whether people criticize it for being affluent, middle class, or elitist or not, it was certainly linked with class and labor movements. So how do you look at that? And your personal journey, of course, first.
So my personal journey, I have to say, I came back to Pakistan to live, probably for the first time. Actually, I lived abroad during my childhood, just in time to see Ziaul Haq take over. So I was here when Ziaul Haq took over, and I was looking for a job. But what struck me then is that I already had, I suppose, because of the family background, because of whatever, my father called himself a socialist. I had ideas about what is justice. And I certainly also had ideas about women's rights. And because, however liberal my father was, there was a difference between how my brothers were treated and how I was treated. Regardless, we all washed dishes, we all did things together, but there were still those differences. When I came to Lahore, to work here, and I started talking about women's rights, nobody was really interested in taking forward this movement. I have to say, it was when I was back in Karachi that we had this Famida Allah Bakhsh. I joined this little, tiny at that point, women's collective, which was Shirkat Ka. And we met every week. We did whatever it was. And one newspaper had this tiny little thing of Famida Allah Bakhsh. If you remember the famous case of Famida Allah Bakhsh, it was on the third page. It wasn't a front page thing, but it was somebody had been sentenced, Famida, to 100 lashes, and Allah Bakhsh, her husband, to being stoned to death. This was absolutely outrageous for us. And so when we decided to do something, we were 9, 10 women, but we started phoning everybody up to say that, it's a time to come up, stand up, and be counted. And I have to say, sorry, Haris, you're a man. When we talked to our male friends, the reaction was completely different from the reaction of the women. So the women were already being harassed on the street, in their homes, being told what to do, what not to do, etc., etc. But the men's reaction, we didn't set out to start a women's movement. We set out to just get Pakistanis to stand up and protest at what was happening. The men said one of two things. One was that it's martial law and you can't do anything about it, so you just keep quiet. Or the second reaction was, this is Pakistan, for heaven's sake, ये कभी भी हमारे मुल्क में नहीं हो सकता है कि किसी को संसार करें या 100 कोड़े लगाएं वगैरह. The women were very upset. So at that point, I think you got a reaction from the women who have the most privileges, I suppose. They're the middle class working women, professional very often, who led the movement, who had the most to lose. But I think, as Sherry said, we also came up and took that responsibility because we were best placed to face the consequences of activism once, under the martial law conditions. You have to remember political parties were banned, trade unions were banned, there was martial law, there were floggings every day, the whole situation was such. And as I've said in my article, I think really movements come about at particular junctures of history. And so the context determines as much as the activists, the context determines which issues you pick up, how you engage in the public, etc. And at that point, we had a state that was hell-bent on taking away all of women's rights and also of minorities, also of labor, also of political activists, etc. But with women, we were easiest targets, right? Because we had no power anyway. And in a deeply patriarchal society, which we are, it was so easy to show your credentials of being Islamic or whatever by putting women into chadar and chardipari and etc. So I think that context determined as much as we did what issues we picked up. The issues were not, I have to say, it wasn't like we were likely to be put under the Hudud ordinance or but we did feel that this was a tsunami-like movement coming. There was going to be a sea change and you needed to stand up and be counted. And I think, so that's my activism, WAF, Shirkat Ka, etc. But to come to what you're talking about, the differences of today, I think, as I said, the context makes a big difference. And I think the praxis and the modalities, the thinking of activists today is very different from what it was in those days. And I think it's not just who the women are, it's also the context. So after all these decades of struggle, we do not see the kind of improvement of women's rights. As you said, there's all this femicide going on, there's horrible things happening. So all of the work that we've done to achieve policies doesn't translate into everyday life as we would hope to do. So I think there's a different understanding, and for them, the personal is very much the political. We are old activists. We thought, we think much more in terms of political movements, as you're saying. So for us, it was political movements, a political praxis, get out onto the streets, do demonstrations, make yourself visible. I think these people want to change their everyday life. And I think since Zia, we have elided into a situation. First, we were opposed to the state. Today, you have opponents all around you. You have your family, you have your friends, you have your neighbor. So I think we're dealing with a different kind of situation and a different kind of movement. I would not comment on whether there's a movement. I think there's activism. And where there's activism, I think we have to find that link between the kind, and I think it's happening, and hopefully Khawar and others will talk to this. I think there is a link being built between the younger activists who have a new modality and the older ones coming together. We have not yet managed to reach the other social movements as we would like. And so there's a need for the connections to happen, but I think we're moving in that direction.
Please unmute. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Farida. And I'll come back to you again. But moving on to Muhtarma Khawar Mumtaz, your personal journey, of course, and since you have worked on both sides of the table, I mean, you have been a civil rights and a women's rights activist all your life, and a teacher and a journalist, and and championing the rights of women as well as human rights. But you have also served as the chairperson of the National Commission on Status of Women, and you have served 2 terms there. So, I mean, how do you compare the two the hats that you had, and I mean, what was more rewarding, if one was more rewarding than the other? And how do you see the struggle? I mean, in which direction it is moving now? Because currently we see that the National Commission had a chair appointed with no personal issues with the person who's been appointed, but it was against the decision of the committee, of the search committee of the National Assembly, so of the Parliament. So, so where do you see the movement going now, and where do you see the state moving now? And also, if you could comment on what Farida has just said about a far more radicalized society than before. So it's not just the states that you have to take on, or the state policies, particular state policies that we have to take on, but it is also the radicalized society around us that we have to negotiate with on a daily basis.
Thank you. First of all, to Sherry and also to you for this session and giving us the opportunity of writing those personal journeys, because mine was really written in that mode. Uh, from the point, and many of the things that Farida said resonate. From my house was my mother was a radical in thought, maybe married into a more conservative environment, but definitely a radical in thought and a rebel, and inculcated those kind of values in us of self-respect, self-worth, excellence. All those were inculcated from there, and she came from a family where women were rebellious. She was a niece of Isma Chuktai and daughter of Azim Beg Chuktai, both very, very vocally women's rights proponents. But what really triggered my politicization was the anti-Ayub movement. That was I was young. I'd just come out of university, and that movement was, and the People's Party and that agitation. And I'd just come to Lahore, and that's when I got politicized and politicized um, more towards the socialist thinking and thoughts. And that's when I also got politicized from the feminist perspective, which we all, as women in Pakistan, we are constantly conscious of where we stand vis-a-vis the rest of society as a woman, where you find that there is an inbuilt differences between how you treat women and girls and boys. So that is where my politicization takes place. I credit Naseem Jahan Begum for some of that politicization. I credit the People's Party election campaign for that, Dr. Mubashir, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto himself, Begum Bhutto. So all those had an impact. And at the same time, because of that was the time when there were left groups were also forming in Pakistan, being associated with them and working with the community level with them in the railway colonies and everywhere, not always very successfully. We were exploring and finding ourselves in that process. But as Farida said, I'll take one from there. It's the context that defines your activism. And we cannot be stuck in the mode that we were in a certain context. Things evolve. As the situation evolves, our activism also has to evolve. And we engaged with the state. We protested, but at the same time engaged with the state. We lobbied with the National Assembly, Majlis Shura, for the laws that were being brought out, and kept the pressure on, because we felt that women were going to be affected by that. So, so one of the things that I found, that even when we looked at APWA as a social welfare organization, but when you start looking at their history, you find there are moments where they stand up as agents of women's rights. And I think in that, the Family Laws Ordinance is an extremely important outcome of their activism for women's rights within personal family laws. So I think we also learned that there are moments where women come out for women and their rights. And I think we consolidated it because our rights, women's rights under Zia, were really being threatened. Now, as times have evolved, we had democratic process has set in. There were democratic governments. Somehow, the women's rights struggle seemed a little dissipated. I don't think it went away. It didn't. And the shrinking of space that was under Zia is now we seeing it in different forms as shrinking of space. Because Zia's time was also shrinking of space. Women found a space within that shrunk sort of atmosphere. But now I think our strategy has changed in the sense we have to have a new strategy. In a democratic dispensation, how do we engage with the state and how do we voice the concerns of women? I think that becomes the challenge, because we do want a democratic dispensation to flourish. And for that, we need to engage with those who are responsible for the political process. They have to be parliamentarians, they have to be political parties, and they have to be people in power. And while on the one hand, they may be populist and we may get very reactionary people sitting in parliament, and we find that we don't have very welcoming space in that process, we still have to engage, because if we believe in democracy, then we have to engage with the political parties to be more democratic. to give more space to women within their structures, because the movement, what I have discovered through my own the way we've studied, looked at the parliament and those processes, there has to be a very active engagement between the activist and the politician. Without that, I don't think we can make an impact. And that impact has to be, I mean, we all struggled according to what was the biggest pressure at that time, laws that were victimizing women in the name of Islam. Society is more radicalized because of all those, the protection and the promotion it got under Ziaul Haq. And then we've seen that how the whole compromises on the compromises on women's rights with those who are radical and religious extremists. We see that all the time, but we can't keep quiet. We have to raise it, and that is manifested in the personal lives of younger women who are now, they're more out in the open. They're working, they're professionals, they're in universities, and they are facing the brunt of that kind of thinking. And that personal, therefore, is very, very important. It's personal and political for them. But how do we connect it with the larger political process? I think that's the challenge. And that's where I think this connection between different strands of activism, old or new, generational, intergenerational, has to come together. And that's where the challenge is. And therefore, then you come to the point, when you say that I've seen both sides. I don't think the National Commission is an arm of the government in that traditional sense. It is something that the parliament, and through a law, an institution, is being established to make sure that the government of the day is complying with its commitments, whether constitutional as well as international. So it has a watchdog and monitoring role. And I found that it was very difficult at the commission to see the government recognize that role, because governments don't always, they see this as criticism, while I feel that it's not criticism, it's identifying gaps which the government is responsible to fill and should fill, and see it as a constructive role of a commission. But we don't find that kind of a attitude or concern and appreciation of the role of an institution which the parliament itself has established. And I will say that it is the wisdom of women of that time within parliament, a number of them who came through the activist route to the parliament. They are the ones who could think in that mode and look at things in the bigger picture of things, which unfortunately has not been actually internalized by our political parties, especially those in government. So I
Thank
think
you.
that's where the challenge is.
Yeah. Thank you, Khawar. I'm going to put one question to both of you before Sherry. So I would like to ask you, Khawar first, and then Farida. That you see, I recall reading something by Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was I think a political scientist who used to, or a historian who used to teach at FC College in the 1950s, and he writes that a country like Pakistan, which is a product of the communal partition of British India, can actually democratically become theocratic. And he has argued that in the 1950s. Now, whatever Mr. Jinnah Qaid-e-Azam had to say about that is a different issue. But if people, and we have seen that happening in Pakistan, that democracy and progressive values sometimes clash. So how do we, negotiate between the two? I mean, and how have you done that in the last 40, 50 years, 30 years of your activism?
Actually, Haris, what I see is that is the challenge and the struggle. The struggle is between different forces. It's within the context of power struggle. And where do women create spaces for them and make sure that their rights are conserved and protected and actively available to them. Now, when we talk about coming into government, like Sherry is sitting there, or if I go in the National Commission, Farida was also a member of the National Commission in the last term. What we have to see is how do we make it easier for women, facilitate their access to rights and their access to justice. I mean, that is really where the penny drops, because they are denied justice. So it's very important for us to strengthen institutions also, and not be seen. I will also mention here that very often activists feel that if you're sitting in an institution, which may be a government institution, you have been co opted. And I think that has to be revisited. You
Right.
are actually capturing spaces that may go to the radical right if you are not there.
Absolutely.
I think,
Yeah.
so I think we need to be very, very clear on our strategy and see what is strategic at a certain given time. It may be strategic to sit in the parliament at a given point, and it may be strategic to sit outside. So we have to be very, very sharp and active in terms of deciding what strategy works most and where are we losing space. How do we keep the spaces that we have to ourselves and move onwards, and how do we connect with each other to make sure that those spaces remain with us?
Right. Thank you, Farida. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay, I've been unmuted. Okay. So, I mean, for me, I guess Smith is absolutely right. But you get that everywhere, that you can have a theocratic system coming in through democracy. You can have, let's not forget, the Nazis did precisely that. It was through an
Yeah.
electoral process that they came into power. So it's not that democracy is like never going to ever fail people. It does, but nevertheless, it is the best solution and the best system we have for the moment. We haven't come up with a better solution for people's participation in a government by the people. So what we need to do is focus on the people. So while we are looking at Pakistan, I think there are two or three things I just want to quickly flag. One, we presume that Ziaul Haq is the one who put all the Islam into the equation. If you do the history, if you do the research, it's not him. It starts early on and it continues progressively. Actually, it's Yahya Khan who actually decided that the army would be the protectors of the ideology of Islam rather than its territories. So you have that seeping in of a certain vision of Islam, and I think that's the problem here. It's not that Islam, who's to determine? And I think that is what a battle that's ongoing, and I think that has seeped into the polity. However, I think at the same time, let's not forget the international situation also. I think everywhere where you're looking, you have the rise of a conservatism that's coming up, regardless of the shape in which it's taking. So it takes religious denominations someplace, it takes nationalist denominations elsewhere, but it's almost like when you look across that the era of human rights, the era of democratic values is under challenge everywhere. So I'm not so surprised that we have it here. But I think Khawar is right that we need to find the spaces and we need to keep struggling, because at the end of the day, you have to change how people think, right? People thinking differently is how you will make the change. And for people to think differently, we need powerful voices, including from the political parties, who actually stand up and take a stand. So what I've seen in other countries like Austria, instead of the political parties standing up and making a stand, they all shift slightly to the right to deal with the right, so that they believe that we should not be seen as being standing up. So I think that is not just for women, it's a general thing, and I think all of us are responsible as the different people. I also feel, and I've said this several times, that as movements, we do not spend sufficient we don't focus sufficiently on the cultural aspects, on the historical aspects, on what it does, what are we promising? Because we don't really have that. Everyone else, if you look at the religious right has very given rituals and behavior and libas, shibas, whatever it is. There's a form you can join them without actually joining a movement, being out and taking on the risks of activism in the same way. When we have that, we don't look at the cultural aspect, and Haris, you definitely do. So this is one of the areas we do need more focus on the poetry, more focus on who we are as a people, and
I'm
to
so
give the
happy you said that.
I absolutely believe it. And the second thing is, I think we don't read sufficiently history. We don't teach history to children in terms of the plurality that we had. which is narrowing down. That's what we're teaching the children. So I think we have to look at the history and the culture, the diverse cultures that we have and promote.
I'll now thank you so much. I'll just come for the last sort of remarks or comments by Sherry. And Sherry, if you could give us some hope about what is happening in the Parliament at the moment, because we are not very hopeful. I mean, I'm afraid I'm being very. I don't want to lament, but I am very unhappy, I must say, as a citizen of Pakistan, that how are things progressing, and the kind of struggles that you have to wage in the parliament, and you have been one of our most prominent voices when it comes to sanity, when it comes to rights. So what kind of struggle do you have to, I mean, what do you experience, and the hostilities and the hindrances to progressive legislation that you experience, and is there a possibility of things getting better in near future?
Thank you, Haris. That's a large project to take on. But the point is, I think that it is a reflection. What's going on in Parliament is a reflection of the broader political drift to the right. It's international, from Bolsonaro to Trump to Le Pen, and here. So yes, there's a drift to the right that automatically shrinks the space for rights discourse, for women's values, and as Farida says, it seeps into the culture. And I also want to take up what Khawar very importantly says, that there need to be new strategies to discuss that. The connections have to be made, histories have to be retold, because we are not living in a cultural and political vacuum. That is what Parliament also has to grapple with. And sometimes, given a particular day, I'm finding myself alone, and yes, then the People's Party rallies and one or two other parties do step up. But it's a constant holding back of a tide. It's sometimes gets very exhausting. And just moving legislation, I mean, I could look at the domestic violence bit. It's 2004 is when I first moved it. It's taken many shape and forms. उसके बाद डेवोल्यूशन हो गई, 18वीं तरमीम आई, और फिर आपने देखा कि वो सूबों में उन्होंने हर किस्म के, पंजाब और सिंध ने तो मूव कर लिए, सिंध का बेहतर लॉ है 18 मैरिज एज वगैरह से के हवाले से भी, चाइल्ड मैरिज रिस्ट्रेंट्स also just sitting there. So it's remarkable when a bill actually passes in this environment, yet it's still doable. I mean, I think that no politician who's actually interested in pursuing goals, political and democratic goals, or rights goals, is going to invest in a cynical worldview, because then you can't get up in the morning and do your job. The cynicism is a way of life, and it doesn't allow you to then function. And then you ask yourself, what is the point of all this, which we all go through. All of us go through existential questionings, and this book and all of us being together, I think for me it's very inspiring to talk to you all and to move the needle forward. It's a Sisyphean quest. We take that boulder up the hill, and the night it falls down again. We start all over again. That's just how it is. And so if wedges at the ledge on the mountain, that's less, not the peak, it's okay. We have to take our increments as we go along and amplify the spaces. Right now, the advance of the right is to shrink the spaces. You can see that. So it's very often just standing there holding back the tide and making justifications that seem ludicrous in the 21st century, but they have to be made.
Yeah, true. मेरा ख्याल है कि मायूसी और उदासी दो अलग अलग कैफियत हैं. तो मायूस तो बिल्कुल नहीं होना चाहिए, and I think this book is उसको कंफर्म करती है कि मायूसी की कोई बात नहीं है, बट उदास तो कभी-कभी हो सकते हैं बहसियत शहरी. And I think that udasi also becomes important, because then you want to get rid of that udasi, and that can only be possible through joining a struggle. And ladies and gentlemen who are watching us, this is the book.
Ladies and robots. Sorry.
And this is edited by Sherry Rehman with 22 very insightful, brilliant pieces of our leading women activists, journalists, labor rights activists, writers, authors, and media persons. So thank you very much, Farida Shaheed Sahiba, Khawar Mumtaz Sahiba, Sherry Rehman Saiba, for joining me today and e-launching. This is the first session, I believe, and there are going to be more sessions about
Yes.
this book, because
Yes,
each
there are.
essay needs a separate conversation. And thank you very much, Folio Books and Jinnah Institute, for bringing this work out. And I am really looking forward to the Urdu translation, being a Desi bacha. And bacha duniya buddha ho gaya, because that will increase the outreach, and this should be read by all our boys and girls, youth particularly,
Haris,
which I think that the book.
can I just interject to also thank our
Absolutely.
publishers, Folio, and Bilal Zahoor at Folio, who's taken this dream forward.
Yeah. Bilal has been one of our very prominent young independent publishers, very progressive, and I'm glad that you mentioned him. And thank you very much, all of you. And I hope that and look forward to more productive sessions around this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry, for this
Thank you, Sherry.
initiative. And